Naomi Vickers stood in the middle of her own penthouse living room and told every person in it. The speech-language pathologists, the child psychiatrist she'd flown in from Montreal, the developmental specialist on retainer from a private clinic in Yorkville, that she would write a check for $600,000 to whoever could get her son Oscar to say a single word. One word. Any word at all. Oscar was 8 years old. He hadn't spoken in 14 months, not since the accident. I heard all of this from the hallway. I was a plumber. I'd been called up to the 42nd floor to fix a leak in the wet bar, Naomi Vickers' corner suite, the kind of place where the view from the windows costs more per square foot than my entire house in Scarborough. I was standing in the hallway with my pipe wrench and my canvas tool bag, waiting for someone to wave me past the cluster of professionals who had taken over the living room, when I heard it. Not the offer. Before the offer, I heard Oscar. I knew that sound. I knew it the way you know your own name spoken in the dark. Before I tell you what happened in that room, and before I tell you why a plumber in work boots could do in 20 minutes what 3 certified specialists couldn't do in over a year, I need to tell you about my son. Because you cannot understand that penthouse without him. My name is Lorne Mackay. I'm 43 years old and I fix pipes for a living. I hold the maintenance contracts on 4 luxury towers in downtown Toronto, and I have spent 15 years doing the work that nobody upstairs thinks about until something stops working. I have repaired burst pipes in units owned by NHL players and Bay Street partners. I have replaced faulty shutoff valves while the suite's owner took a conference call 12 feet away without once looking up. I am furniture. I accepted that a long time ago. There is a kind of freedom in it, actually, that took me years to understand. I am a single father. My son Arlo is 16 now, and he is the whole reason I was able to do what I did on that Tuesday afternoon in March. Arlo stopped speaking when he was 6 years old. Not autism. Not a developmental disorder. His speech just stopped. Clean, like a switch. The night his mother, my wife Denise, was killed in a collision on the 401 coming home from her sister's place in Kingston. Arlo woke up the next morning and didn't say a word, and for the next 4 years he mostly didn't. The doctors at Sick Kids called it selective mutism, with acute grief onset. They gave it a name, which was something, I suppose. They gave us a referral list and a pamphlet and a follow-up appointment 8 months out and sent us home. There were speech-language pathologists and child psychologists, and one therapist who specialized in trauma and play therapy, who was so good with other kids that she cried in my car after Arlo's second session because she couldn't get through to him either. Not one of them was a bad person. Not one of them was bad at their job. Every one of them cared. But every one of them was also trained to do something, to intervene, to apply a technique, to produce a response. And Arlo, by that point, had already learned that the moment an adult tried to do something to his silence, the silence got heavier. Because his silence wasn't absence. It was weight. It was everything he was carrying that he had no other way to carry. I didn't figure that out right away. I spent the first 2 years doing all the wrong things, which is maybe the only reason I ever learned to do anything right. There was a night, Arlo was about 7.5, when he'd been in what I can only describe as a hard place for most of the day. Not a tantrum, nothing like that. Just that particular stillness he got sometimes that wasn't peace, it was stone. He'd sat at the kitchen table through dinner without touching his food, and I'd tried everything I knew. I'd tried talking, quietly. I tried the communication cards the therapist had given us. I'd tried sitting beside him, which he usually tolerated better than talking. I'd tried putting on the hockey game because he'd always loved hockey, and he'd just looked past the screen like it wasn't there. And finally, somewhere around 9 o'clock, I ran out of things to try. I sat down on the kitchen floor with my back against the cabinets and I stopped. Not because I was giving up on my son, because I was so exhausted that I couldn't do anything else. I had nothing left, so I tried nothing. And after maybe 10 minutes of me just sitting there on the linoleum, saying nothing, doing nothing, Arlo climbed down off his chair. He walked across the kitchen, and he sat down on the floor beside me, close but not touching, and he pulled his knees up and he looked at the same patch of floor I was looking at. And we sat there together for almost an hour. The two of us on the kitchen floor in the dark. and it was the most connected I'd felt to my son in 2 years. That was the night I started to understand something. Not a technique, not a method, just a truth that no pamphlet had ever thought to write down. That sometimes the most powerful thing you can offer a person who has gone quiet is to go quiet with them. Not to fix the quiet, not to fill it, just to sit inside it, together, and let them know they aren't alone in it. I spent the next several years learning how to do that well. Learning to read Arlo, not his words, because there weren't many, but his hands, his posture, the way he held his jaw when he was overwhelmed versus when he was just thinking. I learned that the thing he reached for when he was stressed was a small flat stone he kept in his pocket. Dark gray, smooth from the lakeshore near my parents' place in Collingwood, where we'd gone, that last summer as a family before Denise died. He'd found it himself and kept it ever since, and when the world got to be too much, his hand would go into his pocket and find that stone, and I could see his shoulders ease just slightly, like the stone was an anchor line and he was holding on. I learned to watch for the stone. I learned that what Arlo needed in those moments was not to be pulled out of where he was. He needed someone to come sit in the same place and not demand anything. To just be there, steady, so he could feel that steady was possible. He has words now, Arlo. Not many, still, and he uses them carefully, like each one costs something. But he has them. He's working through grade 11. He has a few friends, quiet kids mostly, the kind who understand that not every moment needs to be filled. He is going to be more than all right. I am telling you all of this so that when I walk you back into that penthouse hallway on the 42nd floor, you understand what I brought in with me when I walked through the door. Naomi Vickers was exactly who I'd expected, and also nothing like it. I'd serviced that building for 3 years without ever seeing her in person. She was the kind of person you know about rather than know. The founder of Vickers Capital, a wealth management firm that ran institutional money across 5 provinces. Her name was in the Globe and Mail twice a year. Her picture was in the building directory in a way that told you she owned the most expensive unit without saying it directly. I knew her the way I knew most of the people at the top of those towers. As a name on a work order, a closed door, a unit I entered only when I'd confirmed she wasn't home. What I didn't know, what almost nobody in that building knew, was that Naomi Vickers had a son. I'd pieced it together slowly, the way you piece things together when you're invisible, and people forget you can hear. A comment from the concierge. A stroller in the service elevator once, briefly. An overheard call through the corridor wall about school accommodations. A son named Oscar, 8 years old, who had been in a car accident 14 months ago. The same accident that had put Naomi in hospital for 6 weeks, and from which she'd recovered in ways you could see, and also, I suspected, in ways you couldn't. And Oscar hadn't spoken since. He'd been fully verbal before. Talkative, apparently. The kind of kid who narrated everything, who asked the sort of questions that make strangers on the subway smile. Then a transport truck ran a red on Yonge Street in December, and everything stopped. By March, Naomi had spent, I learned this only later, close to $300,000 on specialists. Private speech-language pathologists, a child psychiatrist who flew in from Montreal monthly, a therapeutic team from that clinic in Yorkville that didn't take OHIP and had a waiting list for families who couldn't write that kind of check. She had tried everything that money could reach, and I say that without a grain of contempt, because I know exactly what it is to watch your child go somewhere you can't follow and throw every resource you have at the distance between you. You do it because there is nothing else to do. You do it because the alternative is to accept that you can't fix it, and no parent gets there easily. What money couldn't buy was the thing my son had already taught me, was the only thing that worked. I heard Oscar before I saw him. That particular pitch, not a tantrum, not a protest, the sound of a child who is genuinely overwhelmed, whose whole system is too full, who is making noise because noise is the only exit for what's inside. I knew it in my body before I understood it with my brain. Every hair went up on the back of my neck, and I set down my tool bag without thinking about it and stepped into the doorway. The living room was chaos with good intentions. 3 adults were crowded around a small boy who was wedged into the corner between the floor-to-soiling window and the reading chair. Oscar was small for 8, dark-haired like his mother, curled into himself with both arms, wrapped around his own knees and his face down. The sound coming from him was intermittent, pressurized, not screaming so much as a sound that kept escaping, like steam through a joint that can't hold. And around him, everyone doing something. A woman in a blazer crouched in front of him, speaking in a gentle, measured voice. All the right words, all the right tone, all of it adding up to one more input for a child who was already past capacity. A younger man behind her had a tablet out showing Oscar something, some visual aid, trying to attract his attention to a screen when the boy's every sense was already overwhelmed. A man in his 50s whom I took to be the psychiatrist stood back slightly, speaking quietly into his phone. And Naomi herself was on her knees on the hardwood in a white linen blouse that was going to be a casualty of the afternoon, reaching toward her son, saying his name in the voice of a woman who has been terrified for 14 months and has learned to keep the terror very close to the surface so it doesn't get any bigger. Oscar, Oscar, sweetheart, can you look at Mum? Can you just look at Mum for a second? And every word was love, and every word was another stone on the pile. I watched for maybe 20 seconds. Just watched. Because that's what you learn to do when you've spent years reading a child who doesn't use words. You stop looking at the behavior, and you start looking for what's underneath it. And what I saw underneath Oscar's behavior was this. One of his hands wasn't clenched around his own arm. One hand was down at his side on the floor, and the fingers of that hand were moving. A small, specific motion. Back and forth. Tracing. I looked at what was near him. The reading chair had been nudged aside a few centimeters. On the floor, partly underneath it, was a toy. A small die-cast model car, the kind that comes in a blister pack from a pharmacy or a dollar store. A tiny ambulance, white with a red stripe, about 3 inches long. It must have been dropped or knocked loose in the chaos of the afternoon, and it was lying just barely within reach. His hand was making the shape of a rectangle, the shape of that car. I knew what I was looking at. I had learned to read that alphabet on my own kitchen floor, one letter at a time, over the better part of a decade. The woman in the blazer was speaking again. The man with the tablet was trying a new video. Naomi said Oscar's name one more time, and I thought about the 6,000 times I had added noise to Arlo's silence and watched him go further away. And the one night I had run out of things to try and sat down on the floor and found my son already walking toward me. I did something a plumber has no business doing in a 42nd floor penthouse. I said, could everyone please step back, all the way to the wall, and please stop talking. The room stopped. Naomi looked at me. The specialist in the blazer looked at me. The man with the tablet looked at me like I'd materialized from the drywall, because to them, I had. I was the maintenance man. I was the pipe wrench in the corner of the room. The psychiatrist started to object, and Naomi Vickers, and I will always respect her for this, looked at my face and whatever she saw there, some certainty she recognized because she had spent 14 months searching for it and never found it in the people she was paying to have it, made her put her hand up and say, please, do what he's asking. Everyone back. They moved. The room opened up. I picked up the ambulance from under the edge of the chair. I did not go to Oscar. That is the first thing, the most important thing, the thing nobody trained to intervene ever quite manages to do. You do not go to them. You do not close the distance. You sit down somewhere nearby, slightly angled away, not facing them directly, because direct is a challenge when your system is flooded, and you wait. You become the most boring, most predictable, most still thing in the room. You let the quiet do what you can't. I sat on the hardwood floor about 4 feet from Oscar, turned maybe 30 degrees away from him, looking at the middle distance. I set the ambulance down on the floor in front of me, in his line of sight if he chose to look. Not pushed toward him, not offered. Just there. And I went very, very quiet. I want to tell you what that costs, sitting still beside a child in distress, because it looks like nothing and it is actually the hardest thing there is. Every instinct you have is screaming at you to act, to reach, to say something, anything, to demonstrate that you are helping, because doing nothing looks like failing, and in a room where everyone can see you, that pressure is almost physical. I felt it in my sternum, that pull to do something, to justify being there. I breathed, I made my hands still, I made my face neutral and soft, and I waited. The room behind me was silent. Naomi was against the far wall, with her hands pressed together in front of her mouth, watching. And slowly, not quickly, never quickly, the sound coming from Oscar began to change. The pressurized quality eased. The intervals between sounds got longer. Because for the first time in however long that afternoon had been going on, the world had stopped adding things to him. One quiet thing had sat down nearby and asked nothing. After a few minutes, I heard his breathing shift. After a few more, I became aware that he had lifted his head. Not toward me, just up, taking in the room with different eyes now that the room had changed. I didn't look at him directly. I looked at the ambulance on the floor between us. Then I said very quietly, barely above a whisper, one word. Ambulance. Not a question. Not an invitation. Not can you tell me what this is? Not do you want to hold it? Just the word itself, plain, like I was identifying something I'd noticed. Like I was thinking out loud. Like it was the most ordinary thing in the world to sit on the floor beside a quiet boy and name the thing he'd been reaching for. Oscar went completely still. I kept looking at the ambulance, kept my voice the same, steady, low, no urgency in it whatsoever. I said it one more time, just as quietly. Ambulance. And then I waited again. And after a moment that I will carry with me for the rest of my life, Oscar's hand came out. Slowly, carefully, and he picked up the ambulance off the floor and pulled it back toward himself and held it in both hands. And the sound stopped. Just like that. The whole stormed-out, pressurized, 14 months accumulated sound that 3 specialists in a room full of expensive intervention had not been able to reach. Gone. Because somebody had finally said the name of the thing he was already holding on to. Because somebody had looked at him, really looked, and seen not a case, not a symptom, not a behavior to be redirected, but a little boy holding on to the one thing that made the world bearable, and named it. The room behind me made no sound. I could feel it, though, that specific silence of people who have just watched something they cannot explain. I stayed on the floor with Oscar for a while longer. Didn't push. Didn't try to build on the moment. The moment didn't need building on. It needed to be left alone, the way something fragile needs to be left after it's been set down carefully. Oscar held the ambulance and turned it over in his fingers, and I sat nearby and let him have the quiet he'd finally found. After a while, when his breathing was even and his shoulders had come down from where they'd been up near his ears, I stood up slowly and stepped back and looked at Naomi Vickers. She was still against the wall. She had both hands over her mouth, and her eyes were wet, and she was looking at her son, who was sitting on the floor of her living room, turning a $3 toy ambulance over in his hands, like it was the most important object in the world. Which for him right then it was. She looked at me. How, she said, and that was all she could manage. I told her the truth, I said. I didn't do anything he wasn't already trying to do himself. I just got quiet enough to hear it. I told her about Arlo, about the years on the kitchen floor in Scarborough, about learning that the sound, the withdrawal, the stillness that could turn into screaming and back into stillness was never the problem. It was the message. It was the only language he had for something too big to carry any other way. I told her that Oscar hadn't been out of control in that corner. He'd been overwhelmed, and everything in that room, every well-meaning word and helpful tool and expert voice, had been adding weight to a child who was already past his limit. They were drowning him in help, and they'd have kept doing it for another hour with the best intentions in the world, because not one of them had ever learned the one thing that is never in the textbooks. That sometimes the most skilled, most loving thing you can possibly do is nothing at all, done on purpose, with your whole attention. He was reaching for that ambulance the whole time, I said. His hand was tracing the shape of it on the floor. He was telling you exactly what he needed. He's been telling you, probably, in 100 ways you didn't have a language for yet. The tragedy isn't that he can't communicate. It's that everyone around him has been working too hard to slow down and hear it. Naomi closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, something in them was different. Some certainty that had been load-bearing for a long time, about where help came from, about what expertise looked like, about which people in a room were worth listening to, had quietly given way. She remembered the money. She said, "The offer stands, please." I said no. I want to be clear that it wasn't a noble impulse. It wasn't performance. I said no because of Arlo. Because 9 years ago I was in a smaller room with a smaller budget and no specialists at all. And I learned what I learned on a kitchen floor in Scarborough with nobody paying me and nobody watching. I did it because he was my son. And what I did in that penthouse was the same thing. I loved a scared child for 20 minutes the same way I'd learned to love my own. You cannot put a price on that without changing what it is. The moment you take money for sitting beside a frightened child and speaking his language, you turn the purest thing a person can do into a transaction. I would rather stay exactly where I am than do that to the memory of every hour I spent on the floor with Arlo. And there was something else. Something I said to Naomi directly, standing there with my work boots on her hardwood and my tool bag sitting forgotten in the hall. I said, "There are families all across this country sitting on kitchen floors right now doing what I did, alone, with no money and no referrals and no private clinic in Yorkville. They're on the waiting list. They're learning their kids the hard way because they have to. And what reached Oscar today wasn't expensive. It wasn't a credential or a program or a technique with a name. It was patience and stillness and learning to look at a child instead of at the problem. That's learnable. That's teachable. If you want to do something with that money, build something that teaches it. Make it free for the families who can't pay, for the parents on the 18-month waiting list. Put Oscar's name on it so that everywhere he goes for the rest of his life, the world has one more reason to learn his language." Naomi didn't say anything for a long time. She looked at her son on the floor. He was still holding the ambulance, running his thumb along the red stripe on the side. Then she nodded, very slowly. The way you nod when something clicks into place that's been loose for a long time and you know it's never going back. I went back down in the service elevator and got my pipe wrench and fixed the leak in the wet bar. I took 45 minutes to do a job that should have taken 20, because my hands weren't quite steady and I kept having to sit on the edge of the cabinet and breathe. That was just over a year ago. Naomi built the thing. I don't know exactly what she spent in total, more than the $600,000 she'd offered me, I'd guess, considerably more. Within the year there was a center, a real one, in a space she'd had redesigned from the ground up with input from occupational therapists and families and, eventually, from me. Soft lighting on dimmers, quiet rooms with nothing in them to overwhelm a flooded little nervous system, spaces built to reduce input rather than maximize it. Staff trained not in technique but in presence, in how to go quiet, how to observe, how to see what a child is reaching for underneath the behavior. The center is free for families who can't pay. They have a partnership with a provincial program that funds early intervention for selective mutism and trauma-related communication difficulties. Last I heard, they'd worked with over 200 families in the first year alone. 200. Because a little boy traced the shape of an ambulance on a hardwood floor, and somebody finally saw it. There's a wall near the entrance where families can put up photos of their kids. Oscar's photo is up there. He's smiling in it, holding a small model car, an ambulance, of course, and looking directly at the camera. Underneath the photo wall, in dark letters on pale birchwitch wood, are the words, "Not broken, just waiting for someone to learn your language." I stood in front of that wall for a long time the day they opened the center. Long enough that one of the staff came over quietly to check on me. I shook my head and told her I was fine. I wasn't, quite, but it was the good kind of not fine. The kind where something that lived in you alone for a very long time has finally been said out loud by someone else. Somewhere permanent, where frightened parents will walk in on the worst day of their lives and read it and know they aren't crazy and their child isn't broken and there is a way through. I still fix pipes. I still take the service elevator. My name is still on a patch on my shirt that most of the people in those buildings don't bother to read, and I've made a thorough peace with that. 2 evenings a week now, I sit in a bright, quiet room at the center and talk to parents. Mostly I listen, because that, as it turns out, is the thing I got best at. The evening after the center opened, I called Arlo. He's got his own place now, a 1-bedroom in the East End he shares with a roommate. A quiet kid from his school who understands Arlo's particular way of being in the world and doesn't try to adjust it. Arlo answered on the second ring, which he always does, and I told him about the center and about the wall, and about Oscar. There was a pause on the line. The good kind, the Arlo kind, where he's taking something in and giving it the weight it deserves before he says anything back. Then he said in his careful, particular way, "You stayed." 2 words, and I had to pull over to the curb, because that was all of it, wasn't it? Every kitchen floor, every midnight, every moment I'd run out of things to try and sat down in the middle of it anyway, because leaving wasn't something I knew how to do. You stayed. Yeah, buddy, I did, because somewhere along the way you taught me that the staying is the whole thing. That's what it's always been. You just had to wait long enough for me to understand it, and I will spend the rest of my life being grateful you did.